Welcome everybody to this DDEX webinar. We are speaking here from London and welcome from wherever you happen to be in the world. The focus of today's webinar is looking at how you prepare the data that you need when you plan to implement one of the DDEX communication standards. I think the point that we're seeking to make here that it is not simply a question of writing the code that allows you to send DDEX formatted messages, but it is very much also to do with the data that you're going to communicate, how that is set up in your systems, how deep it is, what the quality of it is, and those sorts of issues. And that's what we're going to focus on today. So my name is Mark Isherwood and I'm here with Niels Romp, my colleague on the DDEX Secretariat. We are sufficiently few people on this call that feel free to enter when you wish to ask any questions. There's no need to sort of wait until the end. It's probably much easier with a smaller group that we deal with things as they come to you, and we will obviously do our best to answer all your questions. So this slide really reflects something I think you probably all know, that in the context of the digital music industry at the moment, where the largest focus is really on streaming or UGC sites or social media sites like TikTok, we're very much dealing with a very high transaction volume, numbers that the industry's never seen before, where each of those transactions has a very low value. And in that context, if you're going to try and manage that level of activity through manual intervention, it's going to be very, very expensive and you're really going to struggle. And in fact, in reality, with the volumes that most companies in the digital music space are now dealing with, using manual intervention simply isn't an option. And so although DDEX has now been around for over 16 years, it was very much formed with that, with the idea of providing mechanisms for the communication of data that prevented such level of manual intervention and actually streamlined the process of sharing data, and also improved the efficiency of sharing data. So as you know, DDEX develops standards with its membership, which are then published for anybody to implement. And there are three areas really where we focus in terms of the standards that we develop. I guess the most well-known area is where we standardize message formats for particular business transactions. And so what that involves is identifying the data points that are needed for you to communicate information around a business transaction to your business partners. And it's not only identifying which data points are needed, but also relationships between them, and very often identifiers as well, to assist in the processing of that data by your business partners. Secondly, we standardize choreographies. Most business transactions in the music industry involve a certain amount of backwards and forwards between two business partners. And if this is being done using computer messaging, then clearly knowing what to expect as a consequence of sending a message to a business partner in return is obviously going to be much better than receiving something that you don't understand and were not expecting. And so the choreography standards set out the order in which these messages should be exchanged, and also define the trigger points that actually determine that a message should be sent. And then finally, we actually define the messaging protocols that you use to exchange the messages using the choreographies. Up until the last 4 or 5 years, most of that has been around the use of secure FTP sites, where the standardization was relatively straightforward. Things like file naming conventions, directory structures on servers, and so on. Fairly straightforward things. But increasingly, the industry is moving towards web services, which is a much more automated way of exchanging messages, very often much smaller messages more frequently. And the standardization of those requires a lot more detail in terms of what the standard needs to set out so that both partners know what's going on if they start exchanging information using web services. So those are the 3 ways in which we standardize various different elements of the music industry. And this is our famous and ever-evolving tube map of the various standards that we have got. And really what you see here are a number of roles that companies may play within the overall music industry ecosystem, and then between them the types of standard DDEX messages that they would exchange for a given business transaction. So between record company, distributor, and DSP, the orange line indicates the electronic release notification message suite, or ERN, which is there to provide information to the DSP about the releases, the sound recordings, the videos that the record company or the distributor is authorizing them to make available to consumers. That message also has been used for communicating that basic repertoire data to metadata companies where that is necessary. And you can see that there are standards for a whole range of different types of transactions between different types of business entities within the music industry. And although the standards are different, for example, the ERN message suite is very much based on releases. In other words, the entity to which a number of sound recordings may be a part of it, and the nearest equivalent in the physical world is an album, obviously. But the same data, pretty much, although with some extra elements, but the core is very much the same, needs to be transmitted by record companies to their music licensing companies, but the music licensing companies need the data focused on the sound recordings rather than the releases on which those sound recordings appear. So there are obviously variations in the way in which these standard messages are constructed. However, what you will find is that the building blocks within those messages are very much the same. So the way that DDEX describes a sound recording in the ERN is very much the same as the way it describes a sound recording in the musical, in the standard for the communication of data between record companies and music licensing companies, the recording data and rights standards. And you will see similar things in all of the other standards as well. And this is borne out by what is really underpinning the DDEX standards. DDEX has sometimes been referred to as a language, lingua franca, as it says here. For the music industry, if you don't speak DDEX, it's going to be quite difficult for you to communicate with business partners in the music industry. And the way in which that manifests itself is basically the mechanics of using the DDEX standards. If you want to use a DDEX standard, you need to map the data points in the DDEX standards to the same data points within your database or databases. Very often, in fact, almost always, there will be a different data model in your database compared to the data model that DDEX uses. but basically the function is the same, that you need to map those data points in your systems to the relevant DDEX data point. And then when the business partner receives the message, they basically do the same in reverse. And that's why we often refer to DDEX as a language. It's the language that allows company A and company B to talk to each other, even if their own systems can't talk directly to each other because they're set up differently. They use different data models. And the heart of all this that drives pretty much everything we do when we come to constructing new standards is the DDEX data dictionary. It contains the semantics of all of the terms that we use within DDEX, of which there are thousands, and also has the basic syntax of all of the different messages within the standards and the composites that I've mentioned already. So the composite for a sound recording, where it has certain data elements that are used to describe a recording and how they're linked together in order to be understood by the recipient of the message. So the data dictionary is very much a core of what DDEX does and what DDEX is. So let's now turn to the issue of preparation of data for the implementation of a DDEX standard. If you're going to, or you're planning to implement a DDEX standard, you need initially to get an implementation license. And as I said, this is needed if you're going to implement or move an implementation into your production systems. Companies who use distributors may not need a license because they're not actually implementing a DDEX standard. So for example, indie labels will use a distributor to send their data and their sound recordings and releases to DSPs. So obviously in that context, only the distributor is actually implementing the standard. The independent label may not be, and therefore does not need a license. However, they probably will need a DDEX party identifier, and I'll explain what those are in a moment. In fact, I'll explain those next. When you apply for an implementation license, you're also allocated a DDEX party identifier. And the reason for this is that it's a way of identifying you using a unique identifier to your business partners when you exchange messages. In the FTP world, that's probably not entirely necessary because the way in which you set up an FTP site, you will know who has deposited a message on your server. However, as we move more to the automation implied around web services, party IDs and the ability to uniquely identify a business partner becomes more important. And where, as I mentioned earlier on, companies use distributors to forward their releases and data to a DSP, where they will need a DPID, is very often the DSP wants to know on behalf of whom the distributor is sending that information. And in that context, therefore, allocating a party ID to, in this case, the independent label that's using the distributor is obviously a valuable thing, again, in terms of aiding identification of who is involved in a particular business transaction. The most important thing about all this, and the good news, if you like, is that DDEX licenses are free, and you simply have to apply for a license and will be allocated a DDEX party ID if you go to dpid.ddex.net. So if you're thinking about implementing a DDEX standard, we think there are a number of decisions that you need to make almost before you start doing any requirements gathering, and certainly before you start any coding. Which business transaction is it that you want to streamline? To use the well-worn phrase, everybody likes standards because there's so many to choose from. In the case of DDEX, there's something like 11 families of standards, which, although they're very much based on the same core elements, obviously have variations because they're trying to deal with slightly different business transaction types within the industry. So the first task is actually deciding which of the standards is the one that's right for you given a particular business transaction. And on the same level, you need to determine as a consequence of that with whom or what type of company do you want to exchange the data. And this is important because many of the standards, for very good reasons, contain different profiles depending on the exact nature of a business transaction. And obviously there are different versions of many of the standards because over the years they get updated and upgraded. So you have to decide with your business partner which version you're going to use. In the case of profiles, just to give a specific example, in the digital sales report message suite standard, which enables DSPs to report usage to rights owners, be they rights owners of musical works or sound recordings, there are several profiles which are designed for the specific type of business that the DSP is using. So there's one called basic audio, which is obviously the main one used for streaming and services of that nature. There's one for UGC and so on and so on. And all of these issues need really to be decided with at least one business partner. We do not recommend under any circumstances really that you implement a DDEX standard on your own. You really need to be doing it with a business partner so that there is a level of backwards and forwards in terms of making sure A, that you comply with the standard, and B, that it actually works for both parties, both in terms of creating the message and then subsequently ingesting the message. And key to all of this, and what Niels will now talk about in more detail, is the data itself. Clearly, data is important in the context of the DDEX standards. Without data, they would be pretty useless. But obviously, having that data has a cost. And the thing that you need to be mindful in this context is that you need to have sufficient data of sufficient quality, both for the transactions you want to do now, but potentially also the transactions you need to do in the future around a particular business transaction. And you need to think carefully about this because obviously there's a cost to creating and maintaining data, whilst at the same time, the more data that you can make available, the better. And there is clearly a balance to be struck between those two objectives. There is no point in creating data that is costly but doesn't get used. But the more data that you can create that is needed for a particular business transaction, the better. And only each business can make that decision. But that is the sort of consideration that you need to come to a conclusion on before you proceed any further. So I'm now going to hand over to Niels, who will continue with the rest of the presentation. Niels, over to you.
Thank you very much, Mark, and good morning, good afternoon, everybody. So let's talk a little bit about the data that we want to share. Data has a function, has a cost. You need to think about what you do about it with respect to the data that you have and that you need to have, not just looking at how things are today, but also in the future. We don't know what happens in the future, obviously. But if you can envisage where you think the industry and your company might be moving, you ought to think about adding that flexibility into your system. Maybe you don't collect the data yet, but you already know how you would do that if and when it comes to it. But it's not just enough to look at what your requirements for data are. You're working in a network with other companies. And on that little diagram, on that little tube diagram, I've added two little arrows, one orange one going from the record company to the DSP, and then one that comes back from the DSP to the record company. And I've just used those two as an example. Could have used any other of those arrows as well. And that is because when a record company sends out an ERN, they will eventually get back a sales report. And that means that if I want to be able to use that sales report, if it is to be of use for me, I need to make sure that my business partner that wants to send me that sales report, or rather that has to send me that sales report because that's a contractual obligation they have. If I want them to be able to do that, I need to provide them with the data so that they can do that. So I must not only cater for my own data needs, but also for my business partners' data needs or data requirements, and potentially for my business partners' data requirements. Because if it comes from a record company to a distributor, to a DSP, and then back to the record companies, there is a longer chain involved. It can also be shorter chains. If a record company, for example, wants to have a license from a music publisher or an authorized rights society or something like that using the MWN, MWL standards, you would send a license request and get back a response. But if I don't provide enough data for my business partner to actually fulfill their function, I will get unusable data, basically. Garbage in, garbage out. So if you have bad data, or if you don't have enough data, it may come back and haunt you later on. You may not realize it immediately that when you send something out, it's not good enough, but you will later on, and you will pay for it in all likelihood. Not just you, but others. But it's also, if you like, a community service. If you provide good data into the supply chain, into the value chain, then others will be able to do their function. And even if you don't receive data about the same entities again, other people will benefit from it across the value chain. And if others do the same thing, then you will benefit from their actions and their provision of good quality data. So don't just think about yourself, think about others as well in this context. On a similar vein, everybody looks at the data from their own perspective. So a record company looks on the data from a perspective of videos and sound recordings. That's the entities they care about. That there's a musical work attached to a sound recording is kind of irrelevant to them. Music rights societies, publishers, they focus on musical works, and DSPs focus on releases, for example. But even if you're, as a record company, using that as an example again, focus on the resources themselves, you may need to think about the underlying musical work as well. Because the DSP may be, well, actually they will be legally obliged, or contractually obliged, to report the usage of the used musical works to the owners of the musical works, publishers and/or music rights societies. So they will need to have that information, and they will ask you for that information. So even if you're not interested in musical works themselves, your business partners may look at the world from a different perspective, and for them a musical work is important, which means it's actually now important to you as well. So there is a benefit, maybe not immediately visible, but in the long run it will be visible, if you prepare the data so that your business partner, from their perspective, can use the data appropriately. to some extent, it's the same that we've said on the previous slide. And I'll come back to this example about a record company that provides label copy data for a record company, because that's what they want to have the DSP provide to consumers for a stream or a download, for example. So they provide the label copy data for a sound recording, send that off or enter that into the system of an aggregator, who then prepares the data, checks that everything is good enough, and sends that stuff then off to the DSP. The DSP sells the music, provides sales report usage to the music publishers, for example, who needs to map the recording to the work. So the publisher will ask the DSP to send them writer information, ISWC information. Well, where does the DSP get that from? Well, the DSP will ask the aggregator for that information. Well, where does the aggregator get this from? Well, the aggregator will ask the record company for it. So even if the indie label, which is just a label, they don't have a publishing arm, if you like, are not really that interested in publishing data, they need to provide it nevertheless, because otherwise the music industry value chain can't really function well. So think about other people's data requirements. But that means, of course, that the record company, the indie label here, needs to have access to that data. Where do they get that data? So they may need to provide or establish internal policies to actually start to collect that data. Does that database even provide a slot for writer information, for ISWC information? A lot of them don't, because they don't care. It's not part of their business model to work with musical works. Just looking at, in this case, a company who did do ERN and suddenly started to want to communicate sound recordings to a music licensing company. That's the PPLs and GVLs and sound exchanges of this world. And suddenly they needed to have access to and provide data to their business partners that they've never dreamt of needing to provide. But if they want to benefit from the network of music licensing companies around the world and generate the revenue or receive the revenue from the licenses that music licensing companies issue and then collect revenues from, well, they need to have this information. Rights delegations. What is a rights delegation? Record companies may ask. I have no idea that these things exist, especially when you're a small independent company that owns everything everywhere and just deals with it, if you like, holistically. Well, you need to have start date and end date where your rights have been delegated to other companies. What's the type of the delegation? A list of the contributors, their roles, whether it's contracted or featured. Music licensing company will want to know that information. You may not have that information. When and where was the stuff being recorded? And that includes the fifth triangle, because if the fifth triangle on a recording that has been recorded everywhere, everything has been recorded in the US, but the fifth triangulist just made his ding in the UK, he is allowed, he is legally entitled to some royalty payments. That means you need to know. Otherwise, that fifth triangulist might become very angry and sue you. Producer information, initial producer, which is the record company that started the whole process of creating a recording, is important. Sound engineer information, but also a full list of all the products on which a specific sound recording happened to be on. That's information a music licensing company needs to know in order to do their function well. If I'm sending it to a record company, who cares about most of that? Yes, it would be good to have a list of contributors, no doubt. But if you're missing out the fifth triangulist, it may not be that critical. All the rest is really important. All the data there is really important for music licensing companies. So think about what is the transaction and what is the data for that transaction that you need to support before you're actually starting to do the implementation. Be sure that you have a path to collecting all this data. As I said, this list came from a record company that had implemented ERN and wanted to now do also implement the radar in standard. Well, that's just an example. The same would apply, or as the equivalent would apply if somebody does ERN and now wants to use the licensing standard to actually get licenses for musical works. You'd have exactly the same kind of problems. One of our members, long-standing members, right from the start, I think he was a member, always keeps reminding us in our meetings to keep separate data separate. So we all need to put on our sorting hat and make sure that the different data that doesn't strictly need to be together is in different buckets. So if two items are different, put them into a different table or into a different column. And if you're not using a relational database, still do the thing. It's just you don't have any tables and columns in that case. So the data about a musical work belongs into a musical work table, not into the sound recording table. At least in principle, and I'll come to that example in a second a little bit more. And also the main title and the subtitle of a sound recording, they ought to be separated. Because if you just have one string and you have main title, open parenthesis, subtitle, close parenthesis, well, what happens if a DSP doesn't want to show the subtitle in the same font, in the same color, but they want to make it in a smaller font in gray instead of black? Well, that's what the ERN standard allows them to do, because the ERN standard actually needs the main title and subtitle to be separated. You can also provide it as in one string. It's always easier to put two things that are separate and put them together rather than break them apart. But if you're providing them already in your system, or if your system already has them apart, then you can support all of those applications and all of those DSPs much better. The same applies for all other business transactions as well, of course. But sometimes it's also worth thinking about shortcuts. I talked about the musical work composite. And you could say, hey, you're a bit hypocritical here. Isn't it the case that the ERN message doesn't have a musical work composite and puts all the musical work tags onto the sound recording? And I've just said on the last slide that that's something you shouldn't be doing. And you'd be right, that's what we're doing. The point is, though, that we started from a clean model and then said, do we need this complication? Because having an extra sound recording and musical work composite to separate those two items makes the message more complex. And for an ERN message, it's not necessary to spell out the musical work. There is some musical work data necessary, ISWC and writer information, as I talked about a little bit earlier. But the full flexibility of having multiple titles for the musical work and having allowing multiple works linked to a sound recording and providing multiple sound recordings for one work, that goes far beyond the scope of the ERN message, which is why in this case we made a shortcut, and the sound recording, the musical work ID and the writer tags are what I would call a displaced attribute. They're not an attribute of the sound recording, they're actually an attribute of a musical work linked to the sound recording, but the little hop we have just struck out of the standard in this case. So think about whether shortcuts are necessary or are beneficial, but beware that if you take shortcuts, it can screw up your system if you're not careful. And what DDEX has done in this case, we started from a clean model. Actually, in ERN3, there is a musical work composite. Nobody ever uses it, but there is a musical work composite. It's in ERN4 where we have said, actually, let's use the shortcut here. And that brings me to another subject. And I was really I only really became aware of this approach when somebody from EMI back in the day came up to us and said that they have redesigned their internal systems and used DDEX basically as a blueprint for it. And at that stage, I started to realize that the DDEX standards that we've developed, they basically represent the collective thinking of the entire music industry, from the studio environment to the rights holders that receive money once music has been played, and everybody in between. So there must be something of value in this collective thinking of how to structure the data. So it's not a bad idea when you're redesigning your systems, when you're realizing, oh, I need more data that I currently can't support, like what that record company did when they suddenly had to support the data requirements of the radar standard. So what do I need to do? I need to redesign or at least extend my system. And it's not a bad idea at that stage to look at the DDEX standard and say, hey, what are all of those attributes, all of those tags that are necessary to communicate a party, a sound recording, a musical work, a write share, a rights delegation, for example, taking the example of earlier. Don't use it one-to-one because DDEX standards are messaging standards, not database standards, but use it as an inspiration. Not a bad idea to get you closer to where you need to be. A little health warning, DDEX doesn't always get it right, but I think over time we're honing in on good structures of the data. But there's one small complication with this honing in on the right way of doing things. That, of course, then also means that different standards may require different data or provide the data in different ways. If you take an example here where record company X, they send ERN 4.2 to all its DSP partners, and now they want to use the radar message to send to music licensing companies. First of all, the radar message needs additional data. We've talked about that. You need to think about whether you have all that data at the right quality, at the right amount, and in the right system. Because as a company, you may actually have different systems that send data to a DSP and one system that actually communicates with music licensing companies. And you may have a different company that talks to musical works licenses to deal with the licensing in of musical works for use in your sound recordings. So you now need to make sure that these different systems properly work with each other. And what happens if one of those systems, where maybe you add new data into because you now have new data requirements, and you now want to change that data, or a user wants to change data there, what does that mean? How does that data get propagated internally back to your ultimate center of truth of all the data? And then there are slight niggles like the ERN standard the ERN standard. The radar N standard is a standard that focuses on sound recordings and music videos, whereas the ERN standard focuses on releases. So the structure of the message is kind of upside down compared to each other. What does that mean for your data provision, for ingestion and message creation system? There will be data gotchas. Everybody who does implementations will get things not quite right immediately. That's why Mark said earlier, we encourage everybody to implement their standards with a partner in mind, or with a partner, together with a partner, or maybe even more partners, to minimize those gotchas, or to actually make sure that you learn from other people's gotchas. If they already tell you don't do this because that'll screw you, you may avoid those things altogether. One of the biggest things in an ecosystem where many people communicate with many people is that while everybody has their own language, there's also this central language, the lingua franca, as Mark called it earlier, that in this case DDEX represents. And that means that you need to be able to map your own data to either your business partner's data or to DDEX's way of expressing things. And that can be tricky. For example, ownership data is typically, quite often in companies, represented by just things like territory, period, and the type of copyright, especially when you're dealing with companies and organizations that focus their operations on one territory. Then you can use that country's copyright as your guiding principle. DDEX, as a worldwide standard, can't really focus on individual countries' understanding of copyright. So we have to develop a globally applicable way of expressing ownership data in this case. So DDEX adds this use type as an attribute to providing ownership information. Now you need to map this. What does my copyright mean with respect to these different use types that are being used? May not be a one-to-one mapping possible, but you need to make a mapping. And to support all of this, DDEX has developed several thousands of allowed values. I think it was 4,000 or 5,000 the last time we had a look at it, for different things, from instrumentation to genres to different rights types, everything, use types, obviously, all of those things DDEX has developed over the years. And you have different values in your system. Sometimes they map one-to-one, but sometimes you have 4 values where DDEX has 3 values. And now you need to try to map them to one another. That can be tricky. That may need some extra coding to provide some kind of error handling, as want for a better term, for those things. So just mapping them may not be that easy. Why is that not going further? It is. So all of this work on this mapping from you, from your internal language, from your internal systems to the systems or the standards of DDEX, and therefore all of your business partners, does require, at least in slightly larger companies, some serious company internal collaborations between the IT folks that need to code the different systems, the legal systems who now need to see, hey, we use these rights types, but DDEX has these rights types and we have these use types. What does that legally mean? The finance departments, the international affiliates, especially with larger companies where you have different languages even within one organization. So there is some good planning needed to accompany this implementation of the DDEX standard, which basically means that implementing a DDEX standard, the critical bit is not implementing the DDEX standard. It's actually readying your system, readying your data, readying your policies and processes so that you can make use of the DDEX standards. That's the actual cost. The coding is the trivial exercise. Sorry, IT folks, I don't mean to downplay your importance. Clearly, getting a solid implementation is essential for this, but it's the policies and the data cleaning and those things that actually are the crucial bit, in my view. People always tell us that even though that is a cost, in the end, it is worth it. So I'll just finish on 6 steps to success. This is a list that I've adapted from a presentation that PPL gave in late 2021 on things that people need to keep in mind when they're implementing DDEX, when they're implementing either a new message or when they updating something to when DDEX has updated standard and they want to update, or they need to use more features of a standard, those kind of things. And the person who originally gave that presentation is on the call, so if I'm talking bollocks, then he can correct me. The one thing that I would start with is to actually have a proper data model. If you're running off an Excel spreadsheet and you want to support different DDEX messages, maybe that's not the right way of operating it. Get a proper data model, do shortcuts where shortcuts are of benefit, keep data separate that ought to be kept separate, all of those principles that we've talked about a little bit earlier. And then map your language to DDEX's language. That's not a trivial exercise, though. Quite an interesting point is when you're looking at those standards that DDEX has provided, they're quite big. They allow a lot of flexibility that you may not need. And if there are certain aspects that you're not interested in, don't implement them, as long as the standard allows them to be omitted. So if in the ERN world, you're not interested in UGC, support for UGC services, well then all of those rights controller information that the ERN standard supports, you may not need. Ignore it. Don't go in those things that you don't need to do. So provide the smallest scope that works for you. But at the same time, think about how you could extend to those bits if in the future you need to do that. Don't box yourself in. The fourth item there, just because a message is valid for DDEX, according to the DDEX specification, whether you created it or your business partner sends it to you, that doesn't mean that the message is useful to you. It still needs to meet your data validation rules. It still needs to, or your business partner data validation rules. So there are some things which DDEX calls business mandatory, which aren't mandatory in the standard, but actually for a specific communication with a specific business partner, you have to have it, otherwise the communication is kind of useless. So think about going beyond the DDEX validation. And there is no substitute for testing with real-world data. If you're just testing with 5 different handcrafted samples, yeah, you'll get 80 or 90% there, but you will get caught out by some of the frankly insane data that some of our musicians put into their products. because that's what they are. They're creative people. What makes the music world go round. But that also stresses the IT systems who think everything should be uniform. It ain't. So test with real world data before you go live. And last but not least, think about not only going forward, where you have much more control of what data comes in, because I can now ask my musician to provide all that data before I do anything, for example. But think also about what you do about the legacy content. Is there something that I need to do? Do I need to clean up that data? Or is it not worth it? Or what's the right approach? I don't think there's one way of doing things, but you need to at least think about what the right approach is for you, for your business partners, and for your business partners' business partners. That's all I had to say. I'm more than happy to take questions, of course, either now or after this webinar is finished. You all know our email address. You can all drop us an email.
So are there any questions anybody has at this stage? I think I just want to stress to finish that although we've kind of highlighted, if you like, the problems and the pitfalls, that's only really to allow people to, when considering an implementation, to be properly prepared. As Neil's indicated, doing all this work is really worth it. It's been proved to be worth it. All of our members tell us that it's worth the pain and agony, because it does mean in the end the communication of data with your business partners becomes considerably more efficient and considerably less costly. But there are these hurdles to overcome first if you're going to get the maximum benefit out of using the standards. So please don't feel that what we've been saying is here are all the barriers to you actually doing implementation. Actually, we're saying here are the barriers, but please do them and you will gain the full benefit of the standards. So unless there are any questions, I think we'll wrap up there. Thank you all for attending. Thanks to Niels, and hopefully have a good day, and see you next time. Thanks very much. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.